good. Thank you so much. I appreciate the kind welcome. And as promised, we will be providing food for thought with this session. We thank you for joining us and having such a distinguished group to talk about multilateral institutions in a transformative age. Now, when the great Bretton Woods institutions were forged, envisioned, developed, and implemented in the wake of the last Great War, climate change was not at the top of anybody's mind back then. However, as we're in this new century, as we think about the challenges that come ahead in the next 50 years, the next 100 years, questions are being asked. Are these multilateral institutions that served the world economy well during that era of the past, are they fit for purpose for the new era? And there were failings as well. There were shortcomings even in those times. Can they be addressed? Could we perhaps imagine a new set of arrangements? How should we fix the world of global international finance seen through the lens of these multilateral institutions in a way that is consistent with the ambition of tackling climate change, something we'll discuss at COP in the coming days, and beyond? That's the big question on the table, and I'm delighted we have three big brains to join us to help us think through this. I'll start with one immediately to my left, Professor Dan Esty. Dan, welcome. You spent a lifetime thinking about and writing about, and indeed as a practitioner leading efforts in American government and now at the WTO and thinking about some of these topics. Can you frame this for us with your professorial hat on?
Sure, Vijay, thank you, and thank you all for staying with us for this conversation. I think one of the themes that's really emerged over the course of this entire week, and certainly over the course of the day, is how important creative finance and expanded and broadened finance is to the response to the climate change challenge in particular, but really to the commitment to a sustainable future more broadly. And I think in that regard, it's quite clear that there's going to need to be a blend of private capital and public finance. And I think one of the other themes that's emerged is the need to really be creative in how we use some of the existing institutions and their financial capacity. And I'm thinking in that regard in particular about the World Bank and the IMF. And I do believe we see new leadership over the last couple of years, and in fact in the World Bank case over the last year, that is really committed to this transformation process, to really finding ways to drive the capital that's needed across particularly the developing world in terms of the build out of the clean energy foundations for the economy of the future. And I think that what is also emerged very clearly, and I say this as someone who spent the last couple of years at the World Trade Organization, that money is not enough. We need as well.
Bear in mind, you're talking to a finance audience, Dan. Are you sure that's the right line to lead with here?
If I leave people with only one message, let it be that there is a need to move in parallel with a structure of trade, an integrated trade system, not one that's breaking apart and fracturing, but a trade system that's pulling together and delivering global public goods. That's the academic term. Climate change response would be the simpler way to put it. And in that regard, we know that there is a value to the money that can be generated from public and private sources from a retooled and repurposed World Bank and IMF, but we also need somebody to actually move the technologies, the projects, the infrastructure that is going to be that clean energy foundation for the economy of the 21st century going forward.
But if we were to take a sober look at the way the world is evolving at the moment, is it fair to say that we're going in the other direction, that we're seeing a world of barriers up, of industrial policy, of protectionism, of broken or at least disrupted supply chains? Is that, and it was happening before the pandemic as well, one must note some of these trends. What do we do about that, especially if what you say is right, that we need that trade and interconnection to achieve some of the goals of climate and sustainability? How do you tackle that?
Well, I think one of the things we have as a resource in this regard is a very dynamic leader of the World Trade Organization in the person of Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. And I think Dr. Ngozi, as she likes to be called, has got a clear focus on the need to hold the system together, but recognizing that to do that, you need to reform it. The system of the past has not been working for some time. There's been a drift away from the trade system as a central feature of global governance. There's been a backlash in many countries against globalization. So I think we need a new fit for purpose WTO for the future. And that process is underway. And I think Dr. Ngozi, with the 164 members of this member-driven organization, are thinking hard about what that looks like. And of course, while we're here this week in Abu Dhabi, and many of us are going, as you've already said, to Dubai even later today for the COP.
And Dr. Ngozi is going to be there as well, right?
She will be. And I think that represents a couple of critical things. Number one, we are going to have for the first time ever in the 3 decades of these COP gatherings, these climate summits, a trade day. And I think that reflects the fact that the trade system represents a point of real leverage for delivering climate change action. Again, these goods and services, technologies and infrastructure across the world at speed and scale. But it also represents that the trade system has its own pace of conversations. And the next big program on that trade calendar in the series of ministerial conferences is the 13th such conference that will be right here in Abu Dhabi in February. So I think Dr. Ngozi is in Dubai to lay the foundation, demonstrate to the world community that trade is part of the response to climate change, to the need for a sustainable future, but also hoping to build momentum for the gathering of trade ministers that will be here in just 2.5 months, and really needing to advance the repurposing and restructuring of the trade system, exactly as you suggest, to be fit for purpose going forward.
That's great. So that's a good vignette, a good example of how multilateral institutions are trying to adapt to this new age. Greg, let's come to you. You're a man from the private sector world in finance. You heard Dan say money is not enough. Do you agree? Can't we solve this problem with adequate? I mean, the world is awash in trillions, especially in the private sector, with the trillions in capital. We had State Street on the stage a little bit earlier today. BlackRock is around at COP. Surely, if we change the incentives facing the private sector, that will lead to that flow of trillions and solve the problem as Adam Smith and the invisible hand would have it happen. And surely Goldman Sachs as well.
Surely. Well, let me first add my thanks, and let me thank the audience. I know you all heard the call for lunch, so you stayed with us, so thank you for that. I want to first tackle, Vijay, the question of whether these organizations have been fit for purpose, and I think the clear and maybe obvious answer is no, and the reason is that the world has never confronted a challenge, that requires this level of coordination. And I think the early returns probably suggest that we're not on pace. And then if anything, some observations could be made that we're moving actually in the opposite direction in some parts of the solution matrix. So Dan makes the point that money is not enough. It would be luxury if it were. I think today it's almost not even a question that we've arrived at yet. Part of the reason is that the quantum of capital is almost unseriously small in terms of closing the gap, point one. I think number two, we all know and have seen that the cost of capital has backed up, pretty quickly. And so even if it were a solution yesterday, surely it isn't today. I think three, to the extent that money was even a solution, we don't even know that we have the right methodologies yet. And certainly not the type that Dan describes in terms of global coordination. It has many facets. When I think about these multilateral organizations, I think the real asset in what we're confronted with, Vijay, is to understand what is the asset truly today with respect to this kind of coordinated outcome that we need. And I think the asset really looks as follows. Neutrality, or at least perceived neutrality, transparency, or at least perceived transparency, deep, tentacles into lots of places of need, opportunity to weigh in on policy, or at least coordinate that, and so on. I could go on. These are vital aspects because what we need is a credible and transparent super nucleus, if you will, of information and context, research, and also points of measurement standards. Those are vital components.
But these are really interesting. We're going to talk in the next session that I'll have on the stage about carbon credits and carbon markets, which is an area that could benefit from more transparency and data but you're talking at a meta level, a higher level.
Well, I was going down. I think where I was going, I think the asset in time will not be seen to be the most credible place for which large scale disbursement will occur. I think the tools traditionally have been aid and loan capital and first loss capital. These aren't the things that will be required, frankly, with respect to the ultimate
Because they're not scalable,
solutions.
or because of the transparency question?
Both of them, but especially that they're not scalable. That money it ends up residing there. That's not where it is initiated. That's not where it's earned or returned.
Right.
And so in order for it to be that super nucleus, for me, those assets will have to be transformed to represent the first layer of really important components. It's, in the sense that, there aren't actually global institutions that can really play those roles. There are many global institutions that can actually disperse capital, and probably more effectively. So I think we will learn that these organizations must evolve for a new purpose, requiring levels of innovation and the convening of talent, frankly, that's not traditionally been its role. That's an exciting, opportunity, and I think one that will happen by necessity. And I think you've already begun to see, the beginnings of that, and I think we must.
Just to finish on this point, can you give a tantalizing example of where you see this beginning to happen? One of the multilateral institutions that might be beginning to do some of the analytics or data, or playing the newer role that you're talking about.
Well, here's
is it happening
thought.
already?
Here's a thought. I think what we have learned, in the recent past, this Bridgetown, initiative, to the extent that it becomes a consensus, really challenges us to do the following, and really to isolate the places where we could get step function improvement. One of the ways you can do that is really helping the developing world leapfrog, which I think we're not currently doing. Some of the hydrocarbon examples that have fueled, a century of industrial activity, by helping them leapfrog that. And we've seen that in other large, fixed investment, type initiatives. That would do wonders, actually, as many of these emerging countries come up the development curve, and hopefully will be using less carbon to industrialize there than their contemporaries did a century ago. I think that's really important, and you see that as an emerging consensus for where I think we need to go.
Well, great. That leapfrog aspiration is certainly our only hope, really,
Yeah.
if we look to the future. Xing, let's come to you. You are at the AIIB, which defies the argument that the development banks can't innovate, because your institution itself is an innovation, right? You're the newest of the big development banks, but your history is with the World Bank, so you've got a foot in both worlds, the old world and the new world. Can you tell us, what is your perspective on the idea of reform of these institutions? What was alluded to as the Bridgetown effort. Mia Motley and others are arguing for fundamental transformation of these institutions. As a man on the inside, what is the transformation that's possible? And let's, again, look at things with our eyes wide open. What are the limits of that transformation? What's not possible given business models, strict rules about maintaining credit, AAA ratings, and so on? There are some mandates that are going to be hard to change, perhaps. So what do you think is feasible?
Yeah, thanks. So, Vijay, just as you said, I mean, AIB is kind of the newest bank to the MDB club. It is right after the Paris alignment. So we kind of in between, right? The kind of the old system and then the new system. From our end, because we could get established with this new mindset, so actually a number of the issues, the current reform that being called is not really kind of applying to us. But in any cases, the bank is very supportive about talking about this MDB reform, and also to stand by to support that. Like for example, some of the reform is to create a simplified and streamlined operational process, to basically to reduce the transaction cost. So AIB, in terms of the governance, we do not have this permanent residence at the board, and it's also the project cycle is quite small. It's quite short. So it's just to say, that the AIB is functioning a little kind of differently.
So a little more agile, a little less bureaucratic, try to move faster on projects. This is the aspiration.
Exactly. But we do believe that it is the topic itself comes to light in a very timely manner, as you said, because a lot of peer MDBs have been established, let's say, in the 20th century, and then we do have, let's say, global challenges and evolving environment, the health issue, climate issue, and the public challenges being faced in the 21st century. So with this said, so indeed, there were, it's quite valid and vital to discuss about it. And then to your point as well, so there are different MDBs were created within their respective mandate, and then on one hand, I think the peers realize the need, welcome this discussion, but on the other hand, there established article of basically the article of charters, right, and then there is established business models that they have to follow. So in order to follow through that kind of the recommendations, we really expect the support from the shareholders to really to hear or to see our shareholders who are looking for the reforms are also ready for the reforms, and to really stand or sit by with the MDBs in order for us to take the actions. So just also to give one example in terms of the areas of reform, right? One of the, I would say, resonate with me significantly is the MDB should be worked better together as a system for the, let's say, transformation impact. So I think it's quite a valid point, because we got feedback or sometimes the criticism that like MDBs are not only competing with the private sector on some cases, and then they even compete among themselves within the group. So it is really not, the MDBs should be doing and then play their value. So what is happening with this is at the kind of the highest the MDB head level, there is indeed deepened communication dialogue within this group, and then to discuss more, let's say, strategic issues, including how to work together. And then concretely, if colleagues here would be attending the COP28, in the following 2 weeks, one concrete, let's say, proposal the MDBs are putting forward on the table is, let's support the country in a country-led platform. So basically, that is to create, this environment or this vehicle so that the different MDBs could really align the mandate with the country's focus and priorities to work together. So that is just one example to share.
That's a great example. Dan, you wanted to jump in on that?
I want to jump in because I think we've identified another of the critical needs that I hope this panel puts forward and the audience takes up and addresses. And that is the need for a more integrated approach that breaks down silos. We've already talked about the silo between or among the development banks. And then you and I have been discussing as well this question of whether the finance and the trade dimensions are coming together. There was discussion of the Bridgetown agenda. Interestingly, importantly, the Bridgetown 2.0 agenda adds trade to the agenda of reform. So it's not just of the World Bank and IMF and the MDBs more broadly. It is bringing in the idea that we do need this trade dimension. And then I think we want to make sure there's one more piece of the bridge that gets completed. And that's the conversation between what's going on here on finance, what is going on the other side of the nation in Dubai on climate change. Because I think there is a worry that sometimes these separate conversations don't come together. And we have, in fact, in the worst of circumstances, even the same governments saying one thing in a climate change context and something quite different when it comes to the finance or the trade that might support the action that they've committed to in climate change.
What do you think, Greg, if I could turn to you on this? Is there still a significant disconnect between finance and climate objectives? What are you seeing from your perch on Wall Street? We had a wave of enthusiasm about ESG investing, led from Europe, but really more of a global trend that began. Now we see something of a backlash on ESG, and we see a green backlash generally. We did a cover story a few weeks ago about this, just in the body politic in some areas. But on finance particularly, how do you see the role of these two different sides of government sometimes, or public institutions. Markets can sometimes be brilliant in connecting disparate things in a Hayekian way, finding the magic of finding solutions from the bottom up. Can this happen now, or are we going to find a period of divergence where public policy leads the way, like the American policy of subsidies through the IRA law, and markets may not come up with the kind of bottom-up solutions short of those sorts of incentives?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this is an interesting problem type in the sense that both policy and regulatory prognoses, as well as capital solutions, are both barreling toward, efforts and frameworks and models, but still in many ways, in their infancy. And how could they not be? We've really only recently come to what I think is still an emerging consensus that this was very problematic. We could identify the cause, and we have some feeling about its mitigants. That's really only in the past handful of years. But I would say, Vijay, that something has, as young people would say, something else has entered the chat, which is the cost of inaction. I think we now understand has gone up enormously. I think there's something very anomalous to what we've seen with respect to climate disasters and the inevitable, climate refugees and movement of populations. I don't know if we had that consensus, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, but we do today. And so when you start to think about the arithmetic that we're all facing, the cost of inaction, costs significant capital, almost unimaginable. It's growing, perhaps at a faster rate than the solutions presently are. And I think I mentioned earlier the cost of capital. And so I think the motivators for getting better coordinated, as my fellow panelists have suggested, those incentives have climbed dramatically. And so the reason why that's important is because you will confront a cost of some type. In financial terms, the denominator, the return on what investment, has changed radically. And so I think we're no longer, sort of faced between two options, which is doing nothing or getting some inferior return or not. We're sort of faced with, getting some kind of return for the ability to continue to play the game at all.
Right.
And that's a fundamentally different calculus. And so I'm compelled, and I think my fellow speaker and fellow Bostonian, Ronald Hanley, was up here talking about the fact that, the capital, if assembled, correctly and against the right incentives, has to rush in. I think the next paradigm shift that we have to go away from and toward is away from compliance, driven solutions and toward a profit-seeking motivation that really will galvanize the private sector in a different way that you don't see today. I think we're on our way there.
Xing, let me ask you to come in on this. It'd be wonderful to see these solutions scaled, especially given the cost of inaction you talked about. Lord Stern's famous report, of course, outlined those very effectively some years ago. It's now much more widely accepted. We're seeing losses, multi-billion-dollar losses, multiple times a year manifest themselves. Insurance markets pull back, for example, in requiring backstops from public institutions. That's where I come to you. If we're going to see this sort of bottom-up private sector response, how do we cross the line of what sometimes is called the bridge to bankability, the scalability challenge? Right. There may be winners and losers, but it's not evenly dispersed, and so we may not be able to see the outcomes that would be optimal. What role do institutions like yours play in that?
Right. I think I quickly have two reflections. One is perhaps to give a boost, right? To give this kind of a more catalytic boost. What the MDBs perhaps can do is to really devise more instrument or product to de-risk this new type of the project. What I mean by doing that is, like for example, by providing this project preparation type of resources, and for example, working with the other kind of low cost or concessional fundings to really create the template to let's say to replicate the project and until it gets to a critical mass, so that it could really be taken over by the market and then at the higher rate.
So we can be more experimental to try lots of things. It seems to me we need lots of new, not only technologies, but projects, resilience efforts. A lot of them may not make money in the first go until we figure it out. And there may be a role for institutions of public funding of that kind of risk and experimentation.
Exactly. And the second point, I would say that I think our financial system has very good tools to assess the risk and the opportunities of let's say the traditional kind of finance and the risk and return. But when it comes to this climate, including the biodiversity, this kind of, let's say, externalities, we may need to think about a better model, a financial model, how to reflect that cost and the return from inaction, or if you do it today,
Right.
and what is your longer term return. I think if that could be reflected in our financial model, it would play, let's say, a very fundamental shift in the way of doing business.
That's a very interesting point. You wanted to
So I
jump in,
just wanted
Dan?
to
We
jump-
just have 1 minute left, so yeah.
One of the things that I couldn't help but take away, not only from our own conversation, but some of the earlier ones, was this quest for some structure of rules and regulations that allow the flow of finance to have an incentive backing and a real push and motivation. And I do think in that regard, some of this is going to be done nationally, but the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the broader trade system represents another potential place to create that structure, that framework. And I think if it's not done consciously and thoughtfully, it'll get done through disputes that will end up at the WTO. And I just want to mention, in addition to being at the WTO and helping Dr. Ngozi with her sustainability agenda, I've continued to play a role with a series of academics around the world, creating a framework that we think could help set the stage for this conversation about a remade trade system aiming to produce a sustainable future. So for those who are interested, it's the Villar Framework for a Sustainable Trade System. It's available at the remakingtradeproject.org website. And it gives, I think, some conversation starters for the governments. They're going to have to pick this up, particularly here in Abu Dhabi in February with the so-called MC13 Ministerial Conference of the WTO.
Great. So not the last word on the subject, but a provocation and a set of really thoughtful interventions that I think we can take forward from here onward to COP in February for the trade gathering and back into our professional lives. So please join me in thanking our expert panel for their provocations and interventions. Thank you.